This video is about the selection process and how we go about hiring the best possible candidate for a vacant position. This video will review how to create shortlist grids to shortlist the applicants to your vacant position. What are job competency used for, and how do you make a connection between the most important parts of the job and designing the interview questions themselves? How to use behavioral-based interview questions, scenarios, and negatively framed questions in order to assess the abilities of your applicants, and then how to do reference checks. Your shortlist criteria tells you who you should interview. The shortlist criteria is generally comprised of the education, work experience, specific skills, or expertise that you can draw from a resume. If you can't determine whether or not the person has these abilities on the resume, then it shouldn't be on your shortlist grid. So here's a sample of a shortlist criteria. And what this shows is the education, the work experience, and the special skills required. And you can see that it's very systematic. We've got the individual's name listed to the left, and whether or not we want to call them for an interview listed on the right. And you can see that, for example, Sam Jones, he may or may not have balance sheet experience, hard to tell from the resume, but we're making an assumption that because the other aspects that we're looking for are present, that he may well be a good person to interview. And sometimes we would use a pre-screen to determine more detail about the resume if it's needed. One of the things that you may want to consider doing is listing the job competencies clearly for the position before you even start shortlisting. So the job competencies are the most important skills or abilities that you need for the candidate to have in order to be successful. So we start by looking at what are the big rocks or the big pieces of the job. You can draw that from the job description and the job posting. We list those competencies, and then we develop interview questions that assess for those competency areas. So the next step is developing the interview questions themselves. You always want to start with a warm-up question, then move into behavioral-based interview questions, scenarios, and sometimes some negatively framed questions. Technical questions are also valuable as well. In particular, they may be important for certain types of work where you want to ensure that the individual has the skills and abilities that you're looking for. So in terms of the initial questions or the warm-up questions that you'll ask the candidate, the purpose of these warm-up questions is to help the applicant get comfortable, settle in, because your job as the interviewer is to bring out the best in them. You want to make sure that you're seeing all that they have to offer and that the process is a positive one for them, even if they're not the successful candidate. Also, warm-up questions, they give insights into the motivation that the individual has for applying, and it allows you an opportunity to just get to know the person in a general sense to get started. So some sample questions which are very typical in the warm-up are, tell us about how your education and experience relate to the position, or what prompted you to apply for the position. Sometimes we ask questions about what do you know about this organization and why do you want to work here. Those kind of questions help us understand what prompted the person and what motivates them to apply for this particular position. Behavioral-based interview questions are quite crucial to having a solid selection process. And behavioral-based interview questions are known to be 3 times more accurate than traditional interviewing methods. And the reason for that is that they ask the applicant to provide examples of times when they've done things. And what we've learned about interviewing is that what an individual has done in the past is very likely to be what they do in the future. So we look to the past experiences to get a very good sense of their future potential. We also look for specific examples. And so this helps us to separate people who are just sort of good talkers to people who really have the valued work experience that we're looking for. Because generally speaking, individuals who haven't had the actual experience will have a difficult time providing specific examples of times when they've performed skills or tasks. Behavioral-based interview questions assess the accomplishments, the actions, the experiences of the individuals, and this is why they're so much more effective than other types of questions. They don't focus on what the candidate might do. They focus on what they have done or what we know they will do in the future. So how do you actually write behavioral interview questions? Well, you usually start with tell me about a time when, describe a time when, give me an example of. So the question itself is designed to ask about a specific example, and it relates back to those competencies. So you might remember a few minutes ago we talked about what are the main or most important parts of that job. And these questions, these behavioral-based questions, are going to ask about times when you've done that in the workplace. And so tell me about a time when you had to manage a conflict. Tell me about a time when you had to figure out a complex problem. How did you go about solving the problem? Those are examples of behavioral-based interview questions. The next type of interview is the scenario question. And a scenario question describes a common job occurrence, and it looks to ask the candidate how they might manage that situation. And so you would design the scenario question based on a common occurrence. And what this shows you is really how a person will think their way through a problem. It's less valuable, I think, than the behavioral-based interview questions because you're not drawing on what they've done in the past. But it also can be an effective tool just to see the sequence of how a person's thought process is around something that might be a very typical work task. So for example, you're a bank teller, you have a customer who has a check not endorsed, and they're insisting it be cashed. It goes against the bank regulations. What would you do? And this help you to see how the person would respond in that difficult situation. Negatively framed interview questions can be very valuable. They ask the candidate about a time when something in the workplace didn't quite go as well as they had hoped or planned. And it can be very insightful about how individuals handle setbacks or difficult situations. I would recommend using negatively framed questions because they help you see how much responsibility the person takes when things don't go well. And often successful candidates will spend more time telling you about the solution that they had, whereas candidates who are maybe a bit weaker will talk more about whose fault it was and try to shift the blame onto someone else. And that can be very helpful and insightful when trying to select the best candidate. So when you're actually interviewing the applicants, some of the common mistakes that people make when they're in the job interview is that they probe until the candidate answers the question correctly. And so they offer so many clues and hints that the person is kind of led towards the answer they're hoping for, instead of just letting the candidates answer in their own way. They offer the candidate too many suggestions and tips. Sometimes they're uncomfortable skipping over a question when it's clear the individual can't answer. And so one of the things you need to consider in order to become really good at interviewing people is you need to become comfortable with silence. It's okay to give someone several minutes if they need it to think about an example, remember an example, or just think of the response. Sometimes very good candidates just need a few minutes to reflect on a question before answering. And so as you become more experienced interviewing people, you become increasingly comfortable with that silence. So just a quick checklist as we're leaving the interview questions section of this presentation. You want to check to make sure that are the questions that you're asking clearly related to the job. And the place that you would find this is on the job posting, in the job description. So looking at the questions and then looking back for a final check at that job description to make sure everything lines up. Are you asking about the core competencies of the position? So the most important parts of the job, do you have questions that assess those skills and abilities? Do you have a warm-up question? And have you left opportunity at the end of the interview for the candidate to close with a comment or statement? With regards to numeric rating systems, and many people like these in order to assess the quality of the interview questions, I suggest using a very simple system if you want to use one, because numeric systems are sometimes challenged in terms of their fairness. I think a clear, simple numeric system like a 0 for did not answer or incorrectly answered the interview question, a 1 for a partially answered question, and a 2 for a fully answered question is very simple, and it is easy to determine the difference between a 0, a 1, and a 2, which is sometimes where the difficulties come in. There needs to be a demonstrable difference between the successful candidate and less successful candidates in case the interview itself is ever challenged, and that's particularly important in a unionized environment. So the final step in this process is to check references. You always want to speak with the individual's most recent boss. This individual will give you the best and most recent insights into the work history of the individual. If it's not listed on the reference sheet, you're welcome to ask for it. Make sure to get permission either in writing or via email from the applicant prior to starting checking references. And you want to make sure that you only contact references that they have provided permission. You may casually know someone who they previously worked for, but that doesn't mean that you're allowed to contact that person for a reference. Permission is essential. So don't call any references without the permission of the applicant. This concludes this short video on selection. I hope it helps you make some good selection decisions.